Tonight, Railway travels through Denmark, along the route of the Vikings. We're traveling from Copenhagen via Odense, Aarhus, and Hobro to Aalborg. We start our journey in Copenhagen. Due to natural disasters and acts of war, there is little left of the old city. Nevertheless, present-day Copenhagen has developed itself into a city where it's pleasant to stroll about and go shopping. The symbol of Copenhagen, the mermaid from the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, watches over the harbor. A sightseeing boat trip is the best way to have a good look at the merchant houses in Nyhavn and Christianshavn. This is the way the merchant ships docked to unload their merchandise centuries ago. It's obvious why the Danes are a seafaring people. This had already begun in the 11th century with the Vikings. Much remains in Denmark from this glorious era. For our first impression of the Viking era, we'll visit the National Museum in Copenhagen. This museum has an interesting collection of utensils and ornaments from the Viking period. The museum also has examples of the clothing Vikings wore. The utensils give a fine impression of their technical abilities. Of course, the museum has no shortage of scale models of the well-known Viking ships. But those who would like to see the real thing must visit Roskilde, just outside Copenhagen. In this Viking ship museum, we learn about all aspects of sailing with the ancient boats. For example, it shows us how sails were made, woven out of sheep's wool, and later rubbed with wax to make them water repellent. It took months to make such a striking square sail ready for use. The museum also displays the excavated remnants of ships. The different sizes and shapes show us that the Vikings had several kinds of ships at their disposal, from big merchant ships to smaller maneuverable warships. The museum also researches the origin and development of Scandinavian navigation. That's why becoming acquainted with the shipbuilding methods of the Vikings is so important. Experts copy the ships according to their original designs in order to understand the utility of their distinctive features. The researchers actually sail the vessels themselves. Thus, they hope to discover more about the Vikings' sailing methods. For example, they discovered that the Vikings' boats were able to sail against the wind. The limited draft of the ships made them suitable for navigating shallow waters, such as rivers and canals. This enabled the Vikings to penetrate deeper into other countries. In the museum, they also dispose of the most persistent misunderstanding about the Vikings. They indeed wore helmets, but without horns. We return to Copenhagen and make our way to the station for our first journey by train. The railway station in Copenhagen has a beautiful interior, which offers the traveler waiting for a train a pleasant way to pass the time. We make our way to the platform, situated beneath the railway station. We're boarding one of the Danish railway company's modern intercity trains. The trains have a distinctive design. They don't have locomotives, but are built in such a way that the cars can be coupled with the front or the back of all the other cars. We're headed for our next destination, Odense, on the island of Funen. This journey offers us an extensive view of the beautiful Danish landscape.
Lord, if you number the stars in the sky tonight, then you gotta know all the people underneath them that need you tonight, tonight, tonight. And Lord, if you could do this one thing for me tonight. There's a family in town that could use your hand tonight. And there's a sister somewhere who's trying to find out things that I know won't turn out right. Oh, tonight.
We're almost at the west coast of the island Sealand. We approach the railway tunnel beneath the Store Belt, the body of water between Sealand and Funen. This railway tunnel was just opened in 1997. Before that, trains were carried over on ferry boats. To substantially ease timetable restrictions, they began boring an 8-kilometer-long tunnel in 1989. The tunnel now consists of 2 tubes, so trains in both directions can ride through the tunnel at the same time. After 8 kilometers, the train emerges on a small island halfway across the water. From there, it continues its journey on the West Bridge, which has a length of 6.5 kilometers. This bridge runs parallel to the new 18-kilometer-long car bridge. The construction of this project took 9 years. After this exciting crossing, we reach Funen. Thanks to the tunnel on the bridge, the travel time has been shortened considerably. The section between both islands takes only 14 minutes, while earlier it took more than an hour. After an hour and a half, we arrive in Odense, the native town of Hans Christian Andersen, the writer of famous fairy tales. Odense, with 185,000 inhabitants, is the biggest city of the island of Funen. The city is more than 1,000 years old and was founded during the period of the Vikings. It has an exceptionally attractive center with pleasant shopping streets. In the center stands an enormous statue portraying the Viking King Knud, who brought various religious relics to the first church of Odense. That's one of the reasons Odense has become a place of Christian pilgrimage. The church's interior is extraordinary. Odense is also the native town of Hans Christian Andersen. Odense honors its most famous inhabitant in a special way. The entire street where the writer used to live has been restored and established as a monument. The author's birthplace houses a museum. Here you'll find numerous paintings and photos of the famous writer that were made during his many foreign journeys. And of course, here you'll find the manuscripts and first editions of all his fairy tales. In Odense's beautiful railway museum, train enthusiasts can also enjoy themselves to their heart's content. Here, 5,000 square meters is filled with the Danish Railway Company's history, all conveniently arranged, with the old carriages of the Danish royal family as the high point. After this journey through the history of the Danish railway, we make our way to Odense's modern train station. We're boarding the intercity that will bring us to the next destination. The next place we'll visit is Aarhus, on the mainland of Jutland. As we pass by the bridge over the Middelfart, we approach Jutland's mainland. After a 1.5-hour train journey, the station of Aarhus is within sight. Next to Copenhagen, Aarhus has the most inhabitants, 265,000. Train buffs definitely should have a look at the railway concourse. Here they'll find a model railway depicting the complete route we've just made. Aarhus was once a Viking settlement and is therefore situated near the water. The Dome of Aarhus, the biggest church in Denmark, is built at the spot where the first Viking church once stood. In the year 948, the city received a bishop's see. Aarhus is also a cultural city, not the least because of the beautiful music theater. Those who would like to know how the Danes were housed throughout the centuries certainly should pay a visit to Den Gamle By. Here in this open-air museum, they'll find 70 full-size replicas of merchant houses. You won't find Viking houses in this museum. For this, we must go to the country estate of Musgard, just outside Aarhus. On the estate, they built a reconstruction of a Viking house, as well as a Viking church. Inside the estate, they've constructed a museum. Among other things, archaeological finds from the Viking period are collected here. For example, you'll find many of the tools with which the Vikings built their ships. We're back at Aarhus's station to continue our journey. We're headed for a town called Hobro in central Jutland. In less than an hour, we arrive at Hobro Station. Hobro is only a small town with a small city center. However, during the Viking period, this town was an important merchant settlement because of its favorable position deep in the Mariager fjord, making it possible to protect the settlement against plunderers. From Hobro, we take the boat to another former settlement, Mariager. Although you won't come across impressive Viking ships on the fjord, a journey over the water is still certainly worthwhile. The beautiful old houses in Mariager create the impression that even after the Viking period, the city remained a flourishing commercial center. One site worth seeing is the beautiful Birgentine Monastery. In the neighboring Fort Fyrkat, one can get a good idea of what common village life was like for the Vikings. At the moment, they're reproducing a complete settlement, making use of traditional materials and building methods. Volunteers, dressed in authentic Viking clothing, are making traditional utensils by hand. These articles were not only for private use, but also for trading purposes. They constantly kept a fire burning in the center of the village. Usually women sat around the fire doing their handiwork. They also used the fire to bake bread. They put the dough in an iron plate and held it in the fire until the bread was ready. After a few instructions, the visitors are allowed to make their own dough and bake bread. Spinning wool was an important activity for the Vikings. Wool formed the basis for both clothing as well as for the sails of the ships. Next to this village, you'll find the real Fort Fyrkat. This was the home of Viking warriors, who always lived outside the villages. From the fort, we can see our train arriving, so we quickly return to Hobro Station. The train is ready for departure, so we quickly board. It's only a short ride to the city of Aalborg, the last destination of our journey. Only half an hour later, we're approaching Aalborg, a port on the important shipping route through the Limfjord. We're in Aalborg now, a former port, but now a place frequented by convention goers. The enormous convention center is situated directly behind the station. Aalborg's city center still has the flavor of an old sailor's town. This striking house belongs to Jens Bang, a wealthy merchant who built his own house with a self-portrait on it, which, out of disaffection with the town government, sticks out its tongue in the direction of the town hall. These old houses do not constitute a museum, but are simply inhabited by people, although this exclusive way of living is somewhat expensive. In Aalborg, you also find the Danish Naval Museum. It presents an overall picture of life at sea. This museum makes it very clear that Danish shipping, even after the period of the Vikings, remained very important to the economy and to the culture. Aalborg's origin also dates back to the Viking period. This becomes obvious by taking a look at Lindholm Holje, a unique burial place where graves are built in the shape of ships. Next to the cemetery stands a small museum where they display the remnants of the original excavated settlement. It is here that we end our search for traces of the Vikings in Denmark.